In this video clip, I'll be talking about technology at work. I'll be discussing two different views of what technology means and is in work organisations. On the one hand, we have a very optimistic version of technology. This would be the idea that what technology does in work organisations is largely to produce less robotised jobs, to give people more skill, to allow them to engage with their creativity and so on. On the other hand, we have a much more negative view of technology. This would be, if you like, the kind of Frankenstein's monster version of technology. The monster being a technology that actually makes people into slaves of machines and is in direct contrast to the much more positive vision of what technology might be. I'll begin with the more positive views of technology. Now, across the Western world over the last 200 years, we've seen enormous technological advance at work. We've moved from a position of being a largely feudal agricultural economy to one in which most people live in cities and are engaged in complex forms of work involving complex technologies. And a common version of this history would be that what technology has done at work is to take out the unpleasant drudgery. In other words, it's allowed people to work in much more pleasant work environments and to engage with their creativity, with the brain work, if you like, much more than the kind of physical drudgery that they used to do previously. So if we look perhaps at a large industrial town in England, somewhere like Leicester, for example, 200 years ago, what we would see was that the introduction of technology into textiles, in this particular example, was beginning to allow people to escape from the often back-breaking and physical work that was involved in the production of textiles, and instead to be minding machines which were doing most of the complicated physical work for them. Now that vision, that optimistic version of technology, has since mutated into a much more electronic or communications-focused version of technology. And clearly the kind of people who are writing about technology at work are not really thinking about big machines that do things with textiles. They're thinking about computers, about satellites, about information technology and so on. But we get a very similar vision. This is what you might call the Bill Gates version of the world. Bill Gates, the entrepreneur who obviously started Microsoft, wrote a book a couple of years ago now called The Way Ahead. And in this book, he projects a very optimistic version of what technology might do. It's captured in some ways in that rather well-known saying, work smarter, not harder. And visually, I think, in lots of the Microsoft marketing and so on, we have this image of people in air-conditioned offices pointing at laptops, engaged in various forms of front-end creative work. So that version of technology, I think, primarily suggests that what organisations have to do is to cope with technological change by taking out drudgery, by providing the sorts of jobs that creative, highly educated people will want to do. And it's a version of technology which undoubtedly is extremely functional for lots of those people who are engaged in creating technologies, because it's one in which the technology is articulated as a good thing, as something that should be brought into the workplace in order to prevent unpleasant work being produced. Now that's one version of technology, and it's a very simplistic one. What I want to do now is just contrast that to a much more negative version of technology, and then I'll move to compare the two. And the more negative version of technology is one that we get beginning at roughly the same time that the positive one does. That's to say, during the Industrial Revolution. If we think about a book like Frankenstein, what essentially we have there is a book which is presenting technology as something which is a danger to us, something which might present us with all sorts of moral, ethical problems. And a stream of writing and thinking since then has articulated pretty much this view. This would be the idea that technology has produced lots of jobs which reduces us to slaves to machines. So if we imagine the factory, rather than thinking of the factory as a place where unpleasant labour was taken out, what we have instead is the factory as a place where there are people servicing machines. Various people standing there looking terribly bored because they've got nothing else to do than press the green button every time the light goes on, or whatever it is. And the only skilled work that was left in the factory was that of maintaining the machines, or of course of managing the people who were looking after the machines in the first place. This version of technology then has moved now to a computer IT version of the same thing. In other words, we have the image of the call centre. The idea of the call centre primarily is one in which individuals are, in a sense, controlled by forms of technology through prompts on screens, through messages through their earphones and so on, or through time limitations on the amount of time they can spend with customers. So in fact, perhaps the negative vision of technology is embodied within a technology like the call centre. So there we've got a positive and a negative view of technology, both of them, I think, rather extreme. The question then is, what might we as social scientists say to balance out this kind of picture of technology as either good or bad? Now, one of the things that we might want to do is to look at the different impacts that technology has in different areas. And this is where the story starts to get much more complicated. It is, I think, simplistic to assume that technology always does the same things in work organisations. Instead, what it seems to do is create rather different jobs for rather different people. Now, if we imagine a particular organisation, often it will have a variety of different technologies which are imported to that organisation at any one time. Some of those technologies will undoubtedly be de-skilling. This is a word that was used by Harry Braverman, the American sociologist, in 1974. What Braverman suggested was that what technology did, particularly in lower levels of organisations, is to take the skill out of jobs. If you like, the skill gets captured within the machine, and the individual then no longer needs to know the kinds of things they knew previously because the machine can do those things for them. Now, clearly the consequences of this for those individuals can be very severe. It can result in large-scale unemployment, as is obvious, in terms of the ways in which labour can get stripped out by forms of technology. It can also result in extremely dehumanising jobs, the kind of jobs in which people are doing no more than pressing buttons, watching screens and so on, and are not engaged in any sense with any creative form of engagement with people. Again, going back to the example of the call centre, very often the sort of research that's been done on call centres indicates that in fact people working within call centres feel they have much less opportunity to engage with customers than they used to, because of the ways in which technology mediates their activities. So that's certainly the case in some areas of organisation. But it's also the case that in other areas of organisation, usually the more professionalised or the more senior parts of organisations, that technology can there be used to upskill jobs, to increase the kind of capacities that jobs have. We think about the example of distance learning. The kind of video clip that you're watching on the site here is an example of extremely sophisticated information and communications technology. And it's allowing you to watch a lecturer at the University of Leicester talking about the kinds of things that you're studying on your course. This, in no sense, could be described as de-skilling. Indeed, for me as that lecturer, I have actually upskilled myself in order to do these kinds of things. I've had to learn a fair amount about how to present myself on these kinds of video clips, as well, of course, as relying on the kind of knowledge that we have at Leicester about social science and work organisations. So there we seem to have two very different kinds of technological impact, one which could be described as upskilling, one which could be described as downskilling. But the important thing to note is that these kinds of impacts occur differentially. In lower parts of organisations, we tend to see technological impact being largely negative. In the more senior, the higher parts of organisations, we tend to see technological impacts being much more positive. Now, there is a really important lesson in this, and it's a really important lesson for managers, in the sense that if they believe that technology is going to move into their organisations in an uncomplicated way, they've got another thing coming. Because much of the technology that they will be introducing will inevitably be technology that damages people's work lives, that makes their jobs more unpleasant. So it is not at all surprising that many employees will resist technology, because they realise that their jobs will not be the same after the technology has been introduced. So rather than thinking of technology as a simplistic solution to all problems, rather than thinking about it as an entirely positive thing, or rather than thinking about it as an entirely negative thing, what we need to understand is the different ways in which technology impacts on different levels of work organisations. Thanks for listening.